This story does not begin with a revolution. There are no crowds in the streets, no guillotines, no burning palaces, no final speech from a defeated ruler. It begins with silence. A silence so complete that history barely noticed it happening. Before we go any further, leave a comment with what you think truly ends an empire. Is it war, collapse, betrayal, or something far quieter? Your perspective matters here. Most empires announce their end loudly. They fall with banners torn down, crowns shattered, dynasties erased in blood. But what if an empire could disappear without any of that? What if power did not collapse, but simply changed its form so completely that people stopped recognizing it as power at all? That is where Tartary enters the conversation. Not as a myth, not as folklore, but as a recurring presence across maps, documents, atlases, and administrative records for centuries. Tartary was not a single city or a vague region. It was an organizing principle, a geopolitical structure that appeared consistently across Eurasia and beyond. Then, within a remarkably short historical window, it vanished. No declaration of defeat, no coronation of new rulers, no surrender treaties, no public executions of kings, just absence. If you find this unsettling already, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and stay with this investigation until the end. This is not a story meant to be skimmed. When researchers compare maps from the 18th century to those of the late 19th century, something unusual becomes visible. Tartary does not fragment into smaller nations through war. It does not collapse into chaos. Instead, it is quietly renamed, subdivided, reclassified, and administratively absorbed. The borders soften, the labels fade, and eventually the name disappears entirely. But power does not disappear with it. Instead, palaces become government offices. Former imperial cities become provincial capitals. Structures once associated with authority, command, and sovereignty are repurposed, not destroyed. The buildings remain, the infrastructure remains, only the meaning changes. Even more unsettling are the records. Authorities who once appear repeatedly in documents simply stop appearing, not because they die, but because their titles stop being used. Their functions dissolve into committees, councils, departments, and ministries. There are no obituaries for rulers because officially there are no rulers left to mourn. What replaces them is something new. Power becomes technical. Command is no longer embodied by a crown or a throne, but by systems, registries, census offices, surveyors, bureaucrats, archives, standardized measurements, administrative law. Control is no longer theatrical, it is procedural. This is the moment where the nature of rule itself shifts. Instead of asking who rules, people are trained to ask how things are processed. Who owns the land becomes less important than how the land is recorded. Authority stops wearing symbols and starts hiding in paperwork, and here lies the anomaly. History teaches us to expect transitions of power to be violent or symbolic. Kings are replaced by other kings. Empires fall and new flags rise. Yet in the case of Tartary, there is no clear replacement figure. No crowned successor steps forward. No dynasty claims legitimacy. The throne is not seized. It is rendered irrelevant. Cities change their names. Regions are reorganized. Administrative divisions appear where cultural ones once existed. The empire does not lose a war, it loses its visibility, and that raises a disturbing possibility. What if Tartary did not fall at all? What if it was administratively dissolved? In such a transition, authority does not vanish, it disperses. Power becomes harder to point to, harder to resist, and harder to identify. When no one can name the ruler, no one knows where to direct opposition. An empire does not die when its kings are executed. It dies when the idea of kingship is replaced with management. By the late 19th century, Tartary no longer exists on official maps, but the systems that replaced it operate globally, standardized across borders, synchronized through record-keeping and governance models that look strikingly similar from one nation to the next. This was not conquest by armies, it was conquest by administration. And once that transition is complete, history rewrites the past to make it seem inevitable, even natural. The old empire becomes a footnote, then a curiosity, then a myth. Questions about its rulers fade, because the very concept of rulers has been redefined. Yet something about this silence refuses to settle, because empires usually leave ruins when they fall. Tartary left systems, And that is where the deeper investigation begins, as the nature of authority itself starts to unravel, revealing a transition far more profound than a simple change of borders. This transition did not announce itself because it did not need to. It operated beneath the level of public attention, inside filing systems, revised legal codes, and quietly standardized procedures. What had once been rule by recognition slowly became rule by registration. Maps are where this shift becomes impossible to ignore. Early 19th century maps still display Tartary as a coherent entity, vast and unmistakable. Later maps do not show it conquered or fractured by war. Instead, the name is softened, relocated, or removed entirely. In its place appear newly defined regions, governorates, protectorates, and administrative zones. Borders do not look torn apart, they look redrawn. This matters because borders drawn after wars usually reflect conflict. Borders drawn by administrators reflect planning. At the same time, city names change, not randomly but systematically. Names associated with imperial authority are replaced with neutral, functional, or geographic terms. Capitals are downgraded to regional centers. What was once symbolic becomes logistical. Even the language of power changes. Documents stop referring to rulers and begin referring to offices. Authority is no longer something someone embodies. It is something a department executes. Orders no longer come from a sovereign will, but from procedures that appear impersonal and unquestionable. This is not decentralization. It is abstraction. One of the most revealing clues lies in how buildings are reassigned. Structures that clearly exceed the needs of local governance suddenly become municipal halls, courts, academies, or archives. Their scale makes no sense for their new functions, yet no explanation is offered for their origin. They are simply there, inherited, without context. If these buildings were constructed by the systems that replaced Tartary, they would be celebrated. Instead, they are treated as anonymous inheritances, stripped of authorship. And authorship is power. The removal of authorship is not accidental. When no one knows who built something, no one can claim authority over it. When no one remembers who ruled, no one can question the legitimacy of the new order. Another pattern emerges in population records. Censuses expand dramatically during this period. Suddenly, individuals are no longer defined by allegiance, tradition, or local authority. They are defined by categories, names, numbers, occupations, residences. People are transformed into data points. Identity becomes legible to the state in a way it never was before. This is governance without ceremony. No coronation is needed when legitimacy comes from registration. No throne is required when power flows through compliance. Control no longer relies on belief. It relies on participation in systems people cannot opt out of. And once those systems are universal, resistance becomes nearly impossible to organize. Because what would rebellion even look like? Against whom? There is no king to overthrow, there is no palace to storm, there is no face to blame. Power is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This is why the disappearance of Tartary feels incomplete rather than final. Empires that fall violently leave scars. Empires that dissolve administratively leave continuity disguised as progress. History books frame this era as modernization, as rationalization, as the natural evolution from old-world empires to modern nation-states. But this framing avoids a crucial question. Who authorized this transformation? If Tartary had rulers, where did their authority go? If sovereignty existed, how was it transferred without acknowledgement? Authority does not evaporate, it relocates. What appears instead is a global convergence of governance. Different regions adopt strikingly similar administrative models almost simultaneously. Legal systems align, measurement systems standardize, bureaucratic language becomes interchangeable across borders. This is not cultural diffusion over centuries, this is synchronization, and synchronization requires coordination. At some point, someone decided that symbolic rule was inefficient, that crowns were unstable, that dynasties invited conflict, and that management was safer than monarchy. In such a system, obedience is not demanded. It is assumed. People comply not because they fear a ruler, but because the system defines reality itself. Documents determine existence. Records define legitimacy. Maps decide belonging. This is how an empire can end without ending. Tartary does not collapse into chaos. It dissolves into administration. Its rulers do not die publicly. They become irrelevant privately. Their power is absorbed, redistributed, and anonymized until no one can point to its source. And once power loses its face, history loses its questions. But the silence left behind is not empty. It is structured, organized, and meticulously maintained. And the deeper one looks into this transition, the clearer it becomes that this was not the end of rule, but the beginning of a different kind of control, one that still governs the world today. This kind of control leaves traces, but only if you know where to look, not in battle reports, not in royal genealogies, but in the mechanisms that quietly replaced them. One of the clearest indicators appears in legal transitions during the 19th century. Entire legal frameworks are rewritten, not as revolutions, but as reforms. Customary law, imperial precedent, and sovereign decree are gradually replaced by codified systems that claim universality. Law becomes standardized, portable, and abstracted from any ruler's identity. Once law is detached from a sovereign, sovereignty itself becomes unnecessary. Courts no longer serve a king, they serve statutes. Judges no longer represent a crown, they represent procedures. Justice stops being personal and becomes systemic. On the surface, this appears fairer. Beneath it, something deeper is happening. Authority is being relocated from people to structures. Education follows the same pattern. Institutions that once preserved local tradition or imperial knowledge are restructured into standardized academies. Curriculum becomes uniform. History is reorganized into timelines that favor continuity and inevitability. Gaps are smoothed over. Transitions are presented as natural progress rather than deliberate restructuring. Students are no longer taught to recognize rulers. They are taught to recognize systems. Even architecture reflects this shift. Grand structures once associated with imperial command are repurposed for civil administration. Their ornamentation remains, but their symbolism is muted. Flags replace emblems. Seals replace sigils. Identity becomes graphical rather than ceremonial. This visual downgrade of authority is strategic. When power stops looking powerful, it stops attracting scrutiny. Meanwhile, the language of governance becomes increasingly technical. Words like jurisdiction, regulation, compliance, and administration replace loyalty, fealty, and allegiance. These are not neutral substitutions. They redefine the relationship between the individual and authority. A subject obeys a ruler. A citizen complies with a system. Compliance feels voluntary. Disobedience feels irrational. And once this psychological shift is complete, overt force becomes unnecessary. Another revealing pattern lies in infrastructure. Railways, postal systems, telegraph networks, and standardized time zones expand rapidly during the same period. Tartaria disappears from records. These systems do not require kings. They require coordination. They do not enforce loyalty. They enforce synchronization. Time itself becomes regulated. Local time gives way to standardized time. Schedules replace seasons. Life aligns not with tradition, but with systems. This is governance at the level of rhythm rather than command. An empire ruled by time does not need crowns. The absence of resistance to this transformation is often cited as proof that it was beneficial. But absence of resistance can also indicate that resistance had no clear target. You cannot rebel against an archive. You cannot overthrow a registry. You cannot assassinate a procedure. By the time people realize authority has changed, it has already become intangible. This explains another anomaly, the lack of memorials. Empires that fall are remembered through monuments, ruins, and cautionary tales. Tartaria leaves almost none, not because it was insignificant, but because remembering it would require acknowledging a different model of power, a model where rulers were visible, accountable, and symbolically central. Replacing that model with administration required not just new systems, but a new historical narrative, one where empires naturally give way to nations, and nations naturally give way to governance by experts. In this narrative, there is no room for questions about missing rulers, yet fragments remain, in old bureaucratic forms that reference obsolete jurisdictions, in buildings whose scale contradicts their recorded purpose, in maps whose revisions are too smooth, too clean, too final, and in the sudden global agreement on how authority should function. These are not coincidences. They suggest a coordinated transition in which Tartaria's dissolution was not a failure, but a prototype, a test case for a world without visible rulers, a world where power no longer needs crowns because it has procedures, and once this model proves stable, it spreads. The disappearance of Tartary becomes not an exception, but a blueprint, which raises an uncomfortable question. If an empire can be replaced without overthrow, without bloodshed, and without acknowledgement, how many others have undergone the same fate without being recognized? And more importantly, who benefits when no one can identify who rules? The answers to those questions are not found in ruins, but in the systems that quietly define reality itself. And tracing those systems leads directly into the final phase of this investigation, where the consequences of Tartary's administrative erasure become impossible to ignore. Once authority becomes invisible, it gains a new advantage: permanence. Rulers can be overthrown, symbols can be destroyed, dynasties can collapse, but systems, once embedded into daily life, are extraordinarily difficult to remove. This is the silent legacy of Tartary's disappearance. By the late 19th century, governance no longer depends on recognition. It depends on participation. People engage with registries, courts, schools, and administrations, not because they believe in them, but because survival requires it. Birth is recorded, property is documented, movement is permitted, existence itself becomes conditional on paperwork. This is not oppression in the traditional sense. It does not announce itself as domination. It presents itself as order. And order is seductive. What makes this transition so effective is that it reframes authority as necessity. There is no ruler demanding obedience. There is a process demanding completion. There is no command issued. There is a requirement imposed. When Tartary vanishes, nothing appears to replace it because replacement implies succession. Instead, there is normalization. The new order does not claim victory. It claims efficiency, and efficiency does not require legitimacy. This is why the question of Tartary's rulers becomes so difficult to answer, not because they never existed, but because the system that replaced them made their existence irrelevant. Power no longer needs ancestry, it needs functionality. Even rebellion changes under this model. Revolution once meant removing a ruler, now it means disrupting systems, but systems are interconnected. To disrupt one is to affect many. Resistance becomes costly, complex, and isolating. The individual is no longer opposing authority. They are opposing infrastructure. This is not accidental. Infrastructure is political power disguised as utility. Roads, grids, communications, and institutions create dependency. Once dependency exists, authority becomes ambient. It is felt everywhere but seen nowhere. The disappearance of Tartary coincides precisely with the rise of this ambient power, and history reframes this as progress. The empire is described as outdated. Its rulers are dismissed as irrelevant. The transition is portrayed as inevitable, yet inevitability is often the story told after decisions have already been made. What is missing from the official narrative is choice. At no point are people asked whether they want rule by administration rather than rule by recognition. The change simply occurs step by step, form by form, map by map. By the time anyone notices, the old model is no longer accessible. The most revealing evidence of this lies in continuity. Despite the disappearance of Tartary, governance becomes more uniform, not less. Laws align, borders stabilize, administrative language converges. This suggests that something did not collapse but consolidated. A decentralized empire fragments. A centralized system standardizes. What replaces Tartary does not need a name, because it does not need to be perceived as a single entity. It operates through similarity rather than unity, through replication rather than rule. And this is the final irony. By removing crowns, the new order removes the focal point of dissent. By eliminating rulers, it eliminates accountability. Power becomes self-justifying because it is embedded in necessity. You cannot question a process that defines reality. You cannot overthrow a system that claims neutrality. Tartary's greatest loss may not have been its rulers, but the visibility of rule itself. And once rule becomes invisible, it becomes permanent. This brings the investigation to its most unsettling realization. The disappearance of Tartary was not an isolated historical event. It was the first large-scale demonstration that power could survive without sovereignty, that governance could function without kings, that authority could exist without acknowledgement, that control could persist without being named. And once that realization took hold, there was no reason to ever return to crowns. Which leads directly to the final question: if Tartary lost its rulers not through defeat, but through design, then the real legacy of that transition is not historical. It is contemporary, because the world that emerged after Tartary did not abandon empire, it redefined it. And understanding that redefinition is the key to understanding who truly rules now. By the time Tartary disappears completely from official records, the question of its rulers no longer matters to the system that replaced them. That is the final proof of success. When authority no longer needs to explain itself, it has fully transformed. What remains is not absence but inheritance. The modern world inherits Tartary's territory without inheriting its narrative. It inherits its infrastructure without inheriting its symbols. It inherits its administrative reach without inheriting its names. This is why Tartary feels like a ghost rather than a ruin. Ruins demand explanation. Systems demand compliance. The silence surrounding Tartary is not an oversight. It is a feature. Silence prevents comparison. Without comparison, there is no sense of loss. And without loss, there is no reason to ask what came before. This is how power protects itself. The disappearance of rulers removes the human element from governance. There is no one to praise, no one to blame, no one to overthrow. Authority becomes procedural and therefore unquestionable. It does not argue. It processes. And processing does not feel like domination. What Tartary reveals, in the end, is not a hidden empire, but a hidden transition, a moment when rule ceased to be personal and became systemic, when sovereignty stopped wearing a face and started wearing a function. This transition did not create freedom, it created stability. Stability is often mistaken for justice, but stability can exist without consent. It can exist without truth. It can exist without memory. That is why Tartary had to vanish completely. If people remembered a time when power was visible, they might ask why it no longer is. If they remembered rulers, they might ask who replaced them. If they remembered sovereignty, they might question management. So history simplifies. The empire becomes a label. The rulers become footnotes. The transition becomes progress. Yet the patterns remain embedded in how the world operates. Birth certificates define existence. Property deeds define belonging. Identification defines legitimacy. Borders exist because they are recorded. Authority exists because it is processed. Nothing in this system requires belief. Everything in it requires participation. And participation is mandatory. This is the ultimate legacy of Tartary's loss of rulers. Not that an empire fell, but that empire evolved into something more resilient, something that does not need loyalty, fear, or even awareness. A structure that governs by default. When people ask who rules the modern world, the question feels outdated. There is no throne to point to, no crown to identify, no dynasty to name. Power has dissolved into mechanisms so familiar they feel natural. That is the final disappearance. Not of Tartary, but of the idea that power must announce itself. And once that idea is gone, the world no longer looks for rulers. It looks for processes. It does not seek authority. It seeks authorization. In that shift lies the true end of Tartary's rulers. Not in defeat, not in revolution, but in replacement. An empire without crowns did not emerge because crowns failed. It emerged because crowns were no longer necessary. And the most enduring form of power is the one no one remembers choosing. Before you leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think an empire can truly end, or does it only change its shape? Your answer might say more about the present than the past.